My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 62 years old, a widow, and until that night I thought I was still a mother worth honoring. The ballroom glittered with gold light, the clink of glasses echoing like tiny bells. Then came the toast. A joke, they called it, but I felt the sting in my chest as laughter spread relief at my absence. Relief at me. I didn't cry. Not there. I set down the untouched champagne and slipped away before the applause could end. My heels struck the marble floor, each step sharp, almost counting down, like some unseen clock marking the start of something I couldn't yet name. Behind me, the music swelled, muffled through the heavy doors, and I walked into the night air carrying a silence far heavier than my gown. That's where this story begins, with the sound of a toast not meant for me and the weight of a mother's place erased. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know who's walking this road with me. But before I can tell you what came after, I need to explain how Madison and I reached this breaking point. When Walter passed 3 years ago, I thought the hardest part would be learning how to sleep without his steady breath beside me. Madison stepped in then. She hovered at my side, urging me to let her help with the bills, the accounts, the endless paperwork that felt impossible while I was still wearing black. I told myself it was love, the way a daughter protects her mother when grief makes everything heavy. For a while, I believed we were closer than ever. She came by often, filled the silence with updates about work, and made sure I didn't forget to eat. I mistook that attention for closeness, never questioning what strings might be tied to it. Then came her engagement, and with it, little signs of distance I tried to ignore. The invitation didn't arrive until weeks after others had theirs. There was no question about what role I might play, no talk of colors I should wear, no seat reserved at the planning table. Each absence was small, almost dismissible, but together they formed a hollow space where my place as her mother should have been. Looking back, I realized Madison had already been stepping away long before that toast. And when the wedding night arrived, I finally understood just how far she had gone. The night air felt colder than it should have in June. I walked out of that glowing ballroom without a word, the sound of laughter still chasing me through the heavy doors. My heels echoed across the parking lot, and for the first time in years, I didn't look back. At home, I reached for Walter's whiskey. I hadn't touched that bottle since the funeral. The first sip burned, but it steadied me. I carried the glass to my desk, opened my laptop, and let the glow spill across the dark room. For a moment, I saw myself reflected there, a 62-year-old widow who had just been erased from her own daughter's story. That night, I decided I would not disappear quietly. On the corner of the desk sat a sealed envelope, Walter's handwriting clear and certain. A wedding gift. He had called it. My fingers brushed across it, but I wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. First, I needed to understand what had been taken from me while I wasn't watching. As the night stretched on, I began digging through papers I hadn't touched in months, and that's when I noticed the first irregularity: the dates didn't match. I pulled Walter's file box from the back of the closet, the one I hadn't opened since the estate lawyer handed it to me 3 years ago. The scent of paper and dust filled the room as I laid the contents across my desk. At first, it was just as I remembered his original will, neat and straightforward, written in his steady hand. It reflected the man I knew: practical, fair, and clear about how he wanted to protect me after he was gone. But beneath it, tucked almost too carefully, I found something I didn't recall approving: codicils, amendments dated months after his diagnosis, when Walter was barely strong enough to sit upright, let alone handle legal documents. I traced the dates with my finger, my stomach tightening. They lined up almost perfectly with the weeks of his chemo appointments. What struck me most was the tone of these changes: cold, transactional, the language of someone angling for control. It didn't sound like Walter. It didn't even sound like the lawyer. And I couldn't ignore the thought pressing harder and harder, whose hand guided these papers into being. The unease settled heavy in my chest. Something was off, and I needed to know exactly when and how these documents had been altered. That meant one thing: checking the records, starting with the doctors. I cleared the dining table and spread out everything: Walter's estate papers on one side, his old appointment calendar on the other. The pages were worn from years of handling, but his handwriting was steady, precise. I began lining up the codicil dates against his medical visits, almost daring myself to find nothing. But it was impossible to ignore. Every amendment seemed to land on days when Walter had been strapped to an IV, his body drained by chemo. I remembered those afternoons too clearly, how Madison would insist she could take care of the paperwork, urging me to focus on Walter's comfort. At the time, I told myself she was being helpful. Now, the overlap felt like a blade pressed against my chest. I picked up the phone and called Walter's longtime physician, the one who had walked with us through every stage of his illness. I needed to hear his voice, needed something solid. His words hit me harder than I expected. Walter never once raised doubts about my stability or decision-making. If anything, he had expressed worry about leaving me alone. That truth left no room for coincidence. The changes in those documents weren't born from Walter's will. They were engineered. The realization was ice in my veins. If Madison had orchestrated this, then I was already far out of my depth. I couldn't fight this battle alone. I would need help. I sat at the kitchen table long after the sun had set, staring at the pile of papers that had become my new shadow. The truth was sharp now. I could not do this alone. Each date, each signature, each inconsistency added up to something far larger than I was equipped to handle. That's when Walter's voice came back to me, how he used to mention a man he trusted, a retired investigator who specialized in financial fraud. Walter had relied on him once to chase down a crooked contractor. I had almost forgotten the name, but memory is funny that way. It returned when I needed it most. Dialing his number felt like crossing a line I could never step back from. My hand trembled, not from age, but from the weight of what I was about to say. To speak Madison's name in this way, to place her not in the role of my daughter, but as a possible thief, was a wound all its own. But when I laid out the facts, the investigator didn't laugh, didn't brush me aside. He listened, and when he said there was enough to warrant a deeper look, I felt something crack open inside me. Relief, validation, resolve. For the first time, I was not a grieving widow fumbling through shadows. I was a woman naming her enemy, even if that enemy shared my blood. The fight had begun, and I knew the real battle was only just ahead. The investigator's office was nothing like I expected. No flashing lights, no drama, just a quiet room with shelves of thick files and the faint smell of old coffee. But as I sat across from him, I realized the real weight wasn't in the room itself. It was in the papers he spread out before me. Line after line, page after page, he had traced a story I never wanted to believe. Transfers slipping into accounts I didn't know existed. Signatures that carried Walter's name, but not his hand. Small amounts at first, then larger ones, each buried neatly in a system meant to keep me blind. With every document, I felt pieces of my past shifting. Times when Madison insisted she would handle things for me, when she brushed off my questions with a smile. I used to see that as kindness. Now, in this sterile office, those same moments looked like rehearsed cover-ups. The shock was sharp, but beneath it came a grief I can't put into neat words. This wasn't about one cruel toast at a wedding. It was about years of betrayal stitched into the very fabric of my family. Still, as my hands trembled over the files, a different resolve took hold. I could not undo what was stolen, but I could refuse to let it continue. I walked out of that office no longer just a mother piecing through pain. I was a woman preparing for a fight, and the next move would be mine. The restaurant was drenched in sunlight, the kind that made glasses sparkle and silverware chime with every small movement. On the surface, it looked like any other lunch between a mother and her daughter. The soft murmur of voices, the smell of baked bread, the clink of coffee cups, it almost lulled me into pretending we were simply catching up. A part of me wanted that to be true. I wanted to see the little girl who used to slip her hand into mine, the daughter who once ran through sprinklers in the backyard. But as Madison smiled across the table, perfectly composed, I couldn't ignore the other truth the files I had seen, the numbers that betrayed me. Every laugh, every tilt of her head felt rehearsed. I kept thinking of how easily those same hands might have signed Walter's name on papers he never understood. I listened more than I spoke, measuring her confidence against the evidence tucked away in my bag. She seemed certain of her performance, as if charm could wipe clean a trail of lies. And still, a flicker of hope lived inside me that maybe she would soften. Maybe she would offer the truth before I demanded it. But as the plates were cleared and her smile never wavered, I felt the last of that hope harden into resolve. That lunch wasn't reconciliation, it was confirmation. I walked out knowing the battle ahead was real, and that the envelope Walter left me might be the key to opening the next door. The envelope had sat in my desk drawer for weeks, sealed and silent, like it was waiting for me to be strong enough to face what was inside. That night, after the lunch with Madison, I finally laid it on the table. My hands trembled as I slipped my finger under the flap. It felt almost like breaking into a grave, disturbing something that belonged to another world. Inside was Walter's handwriting, steady, familiar, the kind of pen strokes I'd watched for decades on grocery lists and birthday cards. Seeing it again pulled me apart and stitched me back together all at once. Alongside his letter were copies of bank statements, notes in the margins, and dates he had circled. He had seen it. He had known something was wrong long before I dared to admit it. His words weren't dramatic. They were quiet, measured, like the man himself. A line about watching carefully, another about not signing anything without double-checking. And then, at the end, the words that broke me open: protect yourself. Evelyn, I trust you to see this through. I pressed the letter to my chest, tears blurring the ink, and for a moment I could almost feel him sitting beside me. It wasn't just my suspicion anymore. It was Walter's warning, his last act of love. The betrayal cut deeper now, but so did the clarity. This fight wasn't just mine. It was ours. And with Walter's voice guiding me, I knew the next step was bigger than both Madison and me. It was time to bring in the federal authorities. I spent the night before gathering everything: Walter's letter, the bank statements, the investigators' reports. I tucked them into a plain manila folder, but the weight of it felt heavier than any suitcase I had ever carried. It wasn't just paper. It was years of love, betrayal, and silence turned into evidence. Walking into the federal building was like stepping onto another planet. The air was cool, sterile, and the walls echoed with the faint shuffle of footsteps and the low hum of machines. I kept asking myself, would they even believe me? I was just a widow with shaking hands and too many tears behind my eyes. I laid the folder on the desk in front of two agents. They didn't smile, didn't comfort me, but they didn't dismiss me either. They flipped through the pages slowly, marking notes, setting some papers aside, making copies. Their silence carried more weight than any words could have. For the first time, my story wasn't just mine. It had entered the system, the machinery of justice. As I sat there, my chest tight with fear, I realized something had shifted. What began as a mother's suspicion was now a federal case. The betrayal that had felt like a private wound was now being treated as a crime. When I walked out of that building, the afternoon sun felt different. The burden was no longer mine alone to carry. A larger force was moving, and there was no turning back. Still, in the quiet of my heart, I knew I needed to leave something behind, not just for me, not even for Walter, but for Noah. My grandson deserved to know the truth. In my own words, I set the small camera on the desk and stared at the blinking red light. My hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of what I was about to say. Speaking to a lens felt strange, but in my heart, I pictured Noah's face, the soft curve of his smile, the way his eyes carried both his mother's spark and Walter's steadiness. I whispered his name once under my breath before I began. I told him I wanted to leave him something more lasting than money or heirlooms. I wanted him to have the truth. I spoke about Walter, about the man he would only know through scattered memories and stories. I told him how much Walter adored him, how he believed in fairness and integrity. And then I admitted the part that hurt, that Walter had seen signs of betrayal long before I did. He left me notes, bank statements, his handwriting trembling but certain. He knew something was wrong, and he trusted me to protect what mattered. As the words poured out, I felt torn. I didn't want Noah to carry bitterness. He was still young, with his life ahead of him. Yet I couldn't let him walk blind into the same traps of silence and manipulation that had nearly consumed me. I confessed that I was scared of what he might think of me, whether he would see me as strong or simply as a woman too late to protect her own family. But I ended with hope. I told him that truth is a gift, even when it hurts. That love sometimes means breaking illusions, that he carries the best of both Walter and me, and I believe he will choose better than we did. When I pressed stop, the silence of the room wrapped around me. I had no guarantee he would understand, but I knew I had given him something real, something no one could erase. And as the weight settled, I also knew others would try to silence me. The question of my competence was already stirring like a shadow. But at least Noah would have my voice, unfiltered and unbroken. I never thought the sharpest wound would come not from strangers, but from my own blood. When I first heard that my family was claiming I was mentally unfit, I felt the floor drop beneath me. After everything I had uncovered, after the evidence I had placed into careful hands, they decided the easiest way to silence me was to strip away my voice. At first, I was confused. I asked myself if maybe I had sounded frantic in my search, if grief had made me look unstable from the outside. But then I recognized it for what it was, a tactic, a cruel and calculated move, not a concern for my well-being, but a strategy to protect themselves. It was almost unbearable, hearing whispers that the woman who raised them, who held together a household through Walter's illness and after his death, was now being painted as fragile, confused, untrustworthy. It wasn't just an attack on me, it was an erasure. They wanted the world to believe my memories, my judgment, my very sense of reality were crumbling. And the truth is, some days the doubt crept in. I wondered if others would believe them. I could picture the looks, the quiet judgments, the aging widow, chasing shadows, too emotional to be taken seriously. But under the humiliation and hurt, a new steel grew inside me. I was not losing my mind. I was fighting for the truth. And if their weapon was to question my competence, then my weapon would be to prove it beyond doubt. So I made a vow to myself that day I would face their accusations head on. I would undergo every test, every evaluation. I would show them, and anyone watching, that my mind was not broken. This battle had turned personal, but it would not end with me silenced. The next step was clear: prove my clarity and reclaim my footing. I walked into the testing center with my stomach in knots. The air smelled of disinfectant, the kind of sterile place where everything felt designed to measure and weigh you. I kept telling myself I had nothing to fear, but the truth was, being forced to prove my own competence felt like a humiliation I never imagined I would endure. The evaluations began. Memory exercises, problem-solving questions, conversations meant to test judgment and reasoning. I answered carefully, but inside I seethed. How had my life come to this, reduced to demonstrating that I could think straight, that my grief had not broken me, that my fight for truth was not madness? Every tick of the clock sounded like an accusation. Still, I focused. I remembered Walter's handwriting, his plea for me to protect myself. I thought of Noah, who deserved a grandmother who stood tall, not one silenced by lies. With each test, I poured not just my mind, but my determination into the answers. Days later, when the results came back, I held my breath until I saw the words in print: competent, clear, capable. The weight I had been carrying slipped from my shoulders in an instant. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't unstable. I was vindicated. Soon after, I received notice that my accounts had been unfrozen. Logging in and seeing my balance felt like more than just financial freedom, it was dignity restored. My independence was back in my hands, and with it, the power to continue the fight. That moment was more than a victory. It was a rebirth. My name, my voice, my life had been returned to me, and I knew exactly what to do next: turn all of it toward exposing the truth and bringing the guilty to justice. The moment my competence was confirmed, the tide shifted in ways I hadn't dared to hope. What had once felt like me standing alone against a wall of silence suddenly became a gathering storm. The federal agents took the folder I carried and, piece by piece, began to weave it into a larger net. Bank statements, forged signatures, phone records, and even quiet testimony from people I hadn't expected: neighbors, clerks, old colleagues. Each one added weight to the truth I had been shouting into the void. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, methodical unraveling. I would get updates in fragments: an account traced here, a transfer discovered there, timelines that didn't match Madison's stories. Every new piece tightened the noose, and for the first time in years, I felt the lies suffocating them instead of me. Then came the day when it was no longer whispers in an office, but official charges, printed in stark black and white: fraud, forgery, conspiracy. Words that cut deep because they weren't just crimes, they were my family's actions, carried out in the shadows while I grieved. When the arrests happened, I should have felt triumphant. Watching agents walk people I once shared holidays with into custody was surreal, almost out of body. It was vindication, yes, but not clean, not simple. Relief came laced with exhaustion, and with the ache of knowing that justice doesn't stitch a family back together. Still, there was no denying the shift. The fight I had waged in private was now carved into the public record. Truth had clawed its way into the light, and for the first time in a long time, I could breathe. And yet, even in that breath of relief, I felt something unsettled, unfinished, because deep down, I knew there was more. The fraud was only one layer. Walter's absence carried a shadow I hadn't yet dared to name, and soon, that shadow would reveal itself in a way that shattered me all over again. For years, I told myself that Walter's death, though painful, was mercifully natural. He had been ill, after all. The doctors spoke of complications, of his body simply giving way. I tried to believe them. I forced myself to swallow the idea that it was time, that nothing more could have been done. But there were always moments, those flickers of unease that gnawed at me when the house was quiet. The rushed signatures, the sudden changes in his care, the way medication schedules seemed oddly inconsistent. I buried those doubts because the alternative was unbearable. When the federal case pulled back the curtain, those old doubts clawed their way back with teeth. Records showed lapses that weren't accidents, instructions altered, appointments shifted without explanation. Small choices, almost invisible on their own, that added up to a deliberate erosion of Walter's strength. He hadn't simply slipped away, he had been pushed, inch by inch, toward an early grave. The truth struck colder than any betrayal I had faced before. Paperwork could be forged, accounts drained, reputations smeared. But this was the theft of a life. The man I built my world with, the father of my children, had his final days shortened, not by fate, but by hands that should have been holding his with love. I cycled through rage, grief, disbelief, but beneath it all was clarity. The puzzle pieces that had haunted me finally locked into place. Walter's decline was not random, it was engineered, and that knowledge is a weight I will carry for the rest of my days. I don't share this to shock, but to bear witness. Families can hold both love and unspeakable darkness. Power and greed can twist even the bonds we think are unbreakable. Walter deserved better. And so do all of us who are left behind, trying to make sense of the shadows. If you've stayed with me through this story, I ask you to carry it forward. Share it. Talk about it. Protect the ones who cannot see the danger until it's too late. My voice may not reach everyone, but with yours, maybe Walter's truth won't vanish in silence. There are moments when the silence after truth feels louder than the chaos that came before it. Now that the dust has settled, I find myself sitting in that silence, replaying every step, every discovery, every wound. Walter is gone. My daughter is no longer the person I once believed her to be, and I am left with the echoes of both love and betrayal, trying to make sense of how they coexisted under the same roof. What this journey taught me is that danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it wears the face of family. Sometimes it speaks with the voice you trusted most. Wealth and power can twist hearts in ways you never want to believe. And silence, our silence, can be the soil where that corruption grows. I don't regret fighting back, though it cost me dearly. I learned that truth, even when painful, is the only thing that sets us free. I learned that dignity is something you protect not just for yourself, but for the memory of those you've loved. Walter deserved to have his story told. I deserve to have my voice heard. And maybe, just maybe, sharing this will help someone else see warning signs before it's too late. I still grieve, and I still ache, but I also carry a strange peace now, because I know I did not look away. I did not allow myself to be erased. I chose to stand, even when standing meant standing alone. If my story has touched you, if it made you pause and think about your own family, your own choices, then I ask this of you: don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. Leave a comment. Let others know they're not alone if they've ever felt betrayed by those closest to them. Sometimes the bravest act is simply to speak and to keep speaking until the truth can no longer be ignored.